All right. The next topic that we're going to talk about is bureaucracy. And the study of bureaucracy is a study of how you organize your institution in order to make decisions. And it's basically been, started out, the study of bureaucracy basically started out with sociologists. And political scientists. That's where the main discussion about bureaucracy started with. And it wasn't really until the 1970s that you started to see some studies that were using sort of economic methodology in order to examine bureaucratic behavior. The magnum opus of bureaucracy, or what really we started with bureaucracy, was by a guy named Max Weber. He was a German sociologist. And he was writing in the early 1900s. He died in 1920. But he had his big book that was published posthumously was called The Economy and Society. So in 1921, The Economy and Society was published, and in it he has a whole chapter on bureaucracy. And he recognized that bureaucracy was a characteristic form of public administration. That is, if you look at how governments work in particular, governments work and tend to use a bureaucratic framework. Now, there is some things that happen in bureaucracies, and there's a really good movie called Catch-22. It was made from a book. There was also a book by Heller, Joseph Heller, that he points out some of the absurdities of a bureaucracy. And in particular, he's talking about a wartime bureaucracy. And the way the story works is it's about a guy who is in World War II, and he realizes that if you are crazy, then you can be released. You can get out of the battlefield. And so what he does is he pretends to be crazy, but the problem is the psychiatrists say, you know what? You know that if you're crazy, then you can get out of being serving here over here in the battleground, but you must not be crazy because you are pretending to be crazy in order to get out of serving over here, so you can't get out. So it was this, there's a whole host of things that go on in the book and the movie, but the sort of the big point is that he's pointing out some of the absurdities that happen when you have a bureaucracy. So it's an interesting interesting book and an interesting movie to take a look at. Economists did begin to develop a theory of the supply of public goods by economists were looking into the supply of public goods by bureaus. If we recall from Econ 105, Mises in liberalism, right? This is Mises. In 1927, he has a little chapter on a little section on bureaucracy. And what he's saying there is that the private sector bureau looks different than the public sector bureau. That is, if I were to look at, for example, Ford Motor Company, I look at this big corporation, it may look like it's got a hierarchical system where the chief executive officer makes the final decision, and if you want to do something, you may have to go ask the North American bureau chief or whatever in order to get things done, etc. So, but he says there's a difference between a public sector bureaucracy, and the private sector. Trying to see if my writing is any better than it was. Working on it, okay? It may take more than the coronavirus to make it so that my board writing starts to look like Bill Lundberg's, who has perfect, if you've had a class with Bill, he's got perfect board handwriting. All right, anyway, he says there's a difference between the public sector bureaucracy and a private sector bureaucracy, and that is you have information in the private sector that you don't in the public sector. And that information is in the private sector. In the private sector, what do you have? You have profit as a signal. Okay? So, for example, if Ford Motor Company is losing money in its North American operations, it knows that the head of North American operations isn't doing such a good job, right? If the North American operation is doing really well, then you might say, okay, I think that guy, that lady is doing a good job. When I was deputy state treasurer, I was deputy state treasurer for taxation and economic policy. Okay, so I had all sorts of bureau heads that dealt with different taxes. For example, I had somebody who was in charge of the sales tax, and I had somebody in charge of the sales and use tax, and somebody in charge of the at that time they had what was called an intangibles tax, and I had somebody in charge of the income tax. Okay, very difficult for me to know how well any of these people were doing. If there was a big blow up, or if there were, a lobbyist came in and said, oh my gosh, this is, your person that's doing the income tax has got this all wrong and causing us all sorts of problems, etc. Okay, then you might know. But realistically, on a day-to-day basis, you don't have good feedback, so you can't really know how well the people within your bureau are doing. But Mises is arguing that in the private sector that you do have that. Mises later goes along, as I said before, there's a little section in 1927, but he goes along and in 1944, he writes the book Bureaucracy. And if if you again are interested in doing bureaucracy as your paper topic, you might want to glance, take a glance through that book, at least, read through the chapter headings and see if there's something that you find that's interesting in there. And he says, bureaus cannot be managed by profits goals and the economic calculus, since they specialize in the supply of those services, the value of which cannot be exchanged for money at a per unit rate. Okay? So now here he's talking about government bureaucracy, right? He's talking about government bureaucracy, and he's saying that, what's the problem? He says it can't be managed by profits because and the economic calculus, that means prices, right? Since they specialize in the supply of those services, the value of which cannot be exchanged for money at a per unit rate. Okay, so that is, I'm not selling you national defense. Okay, I'm not selling you environmental quality. I can't, you know, if we said, oh, gee, I want to have 6 more units of environmental quality, right? So let's give more money to the Department of Environmental Quality. Can't really do that, right? So he says that there really isn't a good way of making it so that bureaus are efficient. And so his argument is that you realize that government is run by bureaus as opposed to the private sector, which is run by profits and prices. That the only, if you are concerned about all the inefficiencies that have to do with bureaus, then the only way to deal with that is to reduce the size of government. Now, in 1965, Gordon Tullock again. In 1965, we have Gordon Tullock. He writes The Politics of Bureaucracy. And what he does is he looks at, suppose that you have a maximizing bureaucrat, that is a bureaucrat that is trying to maximize their own position. You have a maximizing bureaucrat and says, okay, what would I be doing to, if we assume that's what bureaucrats are doing, how does a bureau work in order to advance and place people within the bureau? Like, how do I know when to, how would I go about moving somebody from the vice president to the president? Or how would I move somebody from being, you know, the deputy assistant for X and move them into assistant for X? How would I move people around? Move somebody from the assistant secretary of defense to the Secretary of Defense. How does that work? And that's really what he was looking at, is movements within the bureaucracy. How do bureaus work internally, is what his book was about. In 1967, Anthony Downs who we've talked about before. Anthony Downs writes a book called Inside Bureaucracy, 1967. Again, looking at how is it that bureaus work internally, how things work inside the bureau. But no one had really taken a look at, okay, if we have a given demand and cost conditions, how much will a bureau supply, right? This is more looking at how do things operate within the bureau, not, okay, how much education would the Department of Education supply? How much defense would the Department of Defense supply? That hadn't really been looked at. So now what we're going to do is, who really took a look at that was Bill Niskanen, William Niskanen, and actually he was one of my thesis advisors when I was getting my PhD at Berkeley. He was at Berkeley at the time, and he later went on to be at the head of the chief economist of Ford Motor Company, and then he became president of the Cato Institute. So anyway, he was the one to start to look at how much of a service is provided by a bureau and how might that get decided. So we want to be careful about looking at two things. One is you have government financing. of goods and government provision or production. An example would be education. We might say that it's the role of government to provide education. Okay, that we read John Stuart Mill, and he says that everybody needs to provide education for the children. If they don't have enough money, then the government should fund that, etc. So we might say, hey, the government's going to fund education. But that doesn't mean the government's going to produce education. So, for example, you could have a school voucher system where the government provides a voucher to low-income people to be able to go out and buy education, let's say K-12 education. So there's a difference between the arguments for government financing and public goods, right? We have already talked about, one of the issues with public goods is that they're non-rival in consumption and they're difficult to exclude, so the private sector may not be able to produce those goods. So we might say, okay, the government is going to provide for national defense, but it might go out and hire private companies in order to produce that national defense, like BlackRock or somebody like that. Okay, so let's take a look at. There's lots of ways to define bureaus, but let's define it for ourselves, or just some of the characteristics that we might want to take a look at with regard to a bureau. There's a couple of things that we would notice here, and the first one is that the owners and employees do not capture any of the appropriate the difference between the revenue and the costs. Okay, so they don't capture the difference between the revenue and the costs. So, for example, if you were let's say Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education, right, the United States Secretary of Education. Betsy doesn't capture any revenue, doesn't like any of the profit that if we looked at the revenues that the Department of Education got and the cost of the Department of Education, then she doesn't capture any of it, right? And some part of the revenue, at least some part of the revenue, put it that way, of the organization derives from something other than the sale of output. From other than the sale of output. And so if we take a look at, let's say, the Department of Natural Resources, the state of Michigan, right? The Department of Natural Resources doesn't sell, I mean, it sells some things, right? It sells hunting licenses, okay? But in general, most of the revenue that the Department of Natural Resources gets is from taxpayer funding. Okay, so if the bureaus that we're looking at here have this characteristic that the owners or the employees don't get to appropriate any of the difference between the revenues and the cost of the organization, and at least some part of it is coming from probably the majority, when we're really talking about government, the majority of the revenue is deriving from other than the sale of output. So if you sort of think about it, almost all the examples that might come into your brain, the majority of the revenue is going to be coming in from something other than the sale of the output. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this a little bit later on, but people might join country clubs. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about this later on. We talk about club goods and whether how those things work, and we talk a little bit about that in public finance as well. For those of you who had the Econ 402, but governments can differ in that rather than a country club, you can't force people to join it, and you can't force them to pay. Whereas a government, it can force you to pay, right? Don't pay your federal income tax, or don't pay your state of Michigan income tax. You'll find that the government's going to come knocking on your door and tell you that you have to do that. Now, it's sort of interesting that, as we just noted, is that some of these public services are provided by profit-seeking firms. Right? It can be provided by profit-seeking firms. One good example here in the state of Michigan is that you have what are called education management companies. Education management companies. And the way they work is you can have charter schools in the state of Michigan and in other states as well, are public schools. So here in Hillsdale, for example, Will Cartland Academy is a public school. But it's what it does is it gets revenue from the state for every student that it has. It gets so many dollars per year per student, and then they use that money to produce the educational services. But they hire, or a number of charter schools do. There's a number of management companies, National Heritage Academies, has a management company, and what it does is it hires the teachers, it maybe has the curriculum, and what Will Cartland Academy does is it hires this other management company to actually run the school, to actually produce the educational services. So you can have public services that that are government services, but you hire private companies to do that. Scottsdale, Arizona was an example early on, and it was published in a number of academic journals about it had a private fire company. That is, the city hires a private fire company in order to produce fire services. So you can see that where we have a difference between the government actually providing the education and the government producing the education. So let's just have some comments about bureaucracies that we might want to bring up. First comment is that there's let me put it this way. There's basically a surprising ethical attitude that some things shouldn't be provided or shouldn't be produced by companies that are making profit, right? So sort of think about it, there's some sort of ethical attitude that some goods and services in particular, shouldn't be done by for-profit. Companies. So examples, education. Some people will say, you know what, we really just shouldn't, these private companies shouldn't be out there providing education, right? That it's really a government's role to provide education. It really shouldn't have these private companies out there that are making profit, right? That's the deal. Well, you know, somehow this is bad that this company is making profit off of your children needing to get an education, okay? So that's an attitude that tends to be out there. Same thing with hospitals. Often you might say, well, gee, this hospital shouldn't be making a profit off of you know, people's illness, etc. Okay? And so it's really just there's an ethical attitude about this, which leads to that these things are going to be produced in a government bureaucracy, and rather than in a manner that is going to increase, that's going to have economic profit as being a factor and prices as a factor trying to drive the supply of goods and services around. This should be done through government. Another thing in these goods that are produced in government bureaucracies is that it's difficult to measure the output. It's difficult to measure at the output. So for example, how can I say, gee, I want 3 more units of national defense, or I want 6 more units of fire services, or I want 12 more units of police protection, right? So it's difficult to measure to define what the output is, and that means if you were thinking that, okay, here's what we could do, is we could contract with somebody to produce it. We'll contract with the private sector in order to produce this stuff. It makes it difficult to contract with the private sector. Because I don't really have a good measure of what the output should be. And so what happens then is bureaus have an advantage in providing goods and services whose output is difficult to define, right? Bureaus, that is, we're talking about government bureaus here. Government bureaus have an advantage in providing those goods that are difficult, that the output's difficult, the output's difficult to define or difficult to measure. Now, it's possible that there'll be advances in the technology that will allow us to solve some of this problem. We may be able to figure out ways to measure here's an increase in the education that you know, we're trying to measure the increase in education that's coming from a school, right? So I've got some school and I'll say, you know what, I'll pay you as a private company, I'll pay you so much if you make it so that every 3rd grader can read at a certain level, right? So I may have advances in the ability to measure reading abilities, or I may have advances in the way of measuring whether people have gained information about mathematics or sociology or or things like that. So it's possible that that those advantages might happen. And also, how do you monitor, right? You have to, how can I monitor whether this company is doing a good job or not, right? I may be able to have better measurement over time. Maybe we can figure out ways to say, okay, they've reduced the probability of a fire happening. Okay? So we might be able to figure that out over time. But as if you're interested in this, the Mackinac Center, if you get on their website, it's like the Mackinac Bridge, right? Mackinac.org. If you look at that, they have a privatization report. They do a lot of work on. They have a lot of work on ways that you can use the private sector to produce goods that are supplied by government, rather than the government doing it themselves. But through government bureaus and government employees, it's being done by hiring the private sector in order to produce what those goods are. So what happens is bureaus tend to tend to measure inputs. Boy, I'm not doing too well here. So you can, I don't, as you know, I don't use these too often. So I can see that I have to just do it one at a time and not run it together too much. All right. But the thing is that they focus on things that they measure what the inputs are. So for example, here's how many teachers that we have. Here's how many students that we've done. Here's how many police that we have. How can I tell that I'm improved my police department? I now have six policemen instead of 3 policemen. Or I have 12 fire trucks instead of 8 fire trucks. So because those are things you can measure. It's difficult to measure the output. I suppose we could look at criminal behavior have we had less crime. But maybe that's happening because there's a change in the underlying circumstances. Maybe people who are criminals tend to have certain socioeconomic characteristics, and those socioeconomic characteristics have changed, and that's why the crime is changing. Or maybe we've changed the way we sentence things, rather than we've got the same amount of policemen, but we've changed the way that we sentence people if they commit a crime, etc. Those are the sort of things that we talk about in the law and economics class. But the point is that there's a tendency then under government bureaus to measure inputs rather than to try to measure what the outputs are. Again, there's an incentive problem. That is, how do I get bureaucrats to perform well? Right, as I was saying before, it's very difficult to measure the output, and so it's difficult to measure whether the bureau chief is doing a good job or not. Mises, again, talking about that, 1927. Right? As I said before, I might be able to know whether this head of North American operations for Ford Motor Company is doing a good or bad job based on what the profit is coming in from there. But it's difficult for me to know how the bureau chief is doing. And so how do I get them an incentive to perform better? And another sort of comment is that the compensation of bureaucrats the compensation of bureaucrats can be other than salary. Now, of course, that's also true of private sector bureaucrats. So, for example, it might be that you have a bigger office, right? Or you have a car, right? It could be a company car in terms of a private sector, or it could be a car that is, you have a government car that you can use. It may be, there's all sorts of things that you might think about what they might have. Notice that it may be difficult to offer the right compensation. So, for example, just as an example that's sort of interesting, the Soviet Union used to exist, right? And in the Soviet Union, it was they had a 5-year plan. They had central planning, et cetera. Okay, and everything was done by bureaus, right? I mean, because it was a centrally planned communist state. Okay, so if we look back to the Soviet Union, interesting is they're looking at nail manufacturing. And what they did was they started to reward the bureaucrats based on the tons of nails. Okay, said, okay, you produce. I'm trying to give an incentive. I've got a problem. How do I create incentives for bureau chiefs to do well? So I'm going to say, okay, you know what? You're the bureau chief in charge of this nail manufacturing plant here in Moscow. How can I? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you more reward. I'm going to increase your salary if you produce more nails. And so what they looked at is tons of nails. They said, okay, you're going to get rewarded on the tons of nails that you produce. Guess what happened? Very large nails. Right? So they got these really big nails. They weren't being rewarded on whether the nails work or not. They were being rewarded on tons of nails. So if you made really big nails, then you use up a lot more steel and to make the nails, and so you'd have more. You'd have tons of nails is the thing that you can try to maximize. So then they said, oh well, that's not working. So what did they do? They switched to number of nails, and guess what? They got lots and lots and lots of really tiny nails. Okay. So, I mean, the point just being that it is difficult to compensate a bureaucrat because you don't have good output measures, and so they'll tend to be rewarded with things maybe other than salary or whatever. But bureaus are hard to run in an efficient manner. Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, he talks about that bureau heads should be rewarded based on their performance, but of course there's not really good way to measure performance. That is the problem. Another point is that if you're a bureaucrat and you're making choices about things, then the losses are diffused across the population. That is, instead of being concentrated on those that were responsible for whatever the bureaucrat decided. So if the bureaucrat decides to do X, and it turns out to be the wrong thing, the bureaucrat doesn't lose their salary, right? What happens is those losses are spread out across the population. Now, what we have going on here is, what we have going on today is, okay, we got to make a decision about what we're going to do with regard to keeping the businesses running, right? Are we going to make it so that people have to shelter in place, and these businesses get shut down. And who loses from that? Not the bureaucrat themselves, but all sorts of the other people that are, this is being diffused throughout the economy as a whole. Similarly with the gains, though, that is, the bureau chief isn't going to get paid more if what happens is the coronavirus ends up by the sheltering in place saves 5 million lives. Okay, they don't benefit from that either, right? So it's again, it's an interesting interesting administrative issue. That is, how do you get it so that bureau chiefs make decisions which are to the advantage of the populace as a whole, right? If you are in the private sector, if you sort of think back, you know, how market capitalism works, okay? System of voluntary exchange. So the only way that I can make lots and lots of profit is to make it so that you guys want to buy whatever product I'm producing at a value which is greater than the cost of the resources that I'm using up making it, okay? Whereas I don't have that ability in a government bureaucracy. I don't have a mechanism to know what the value to you folks are, and so I don't have a good way to reward the bureaucrat, and so you could get things that are spread out. Like I said, the costs are, and the benefits, both the costs and the benefits of whatever the bureau chief is doing are spread out among the populace in general. Now, you know, what, as I said before, up until Bill Niskanen, well, I hadn't talked about Bill in particular, but up until Bill Niskanen, people had focused on how do things operate within the bureaucracy, not a matter of how much public goods will be demanded or how much public goods will be supplied through the bureaucracy. They were mostly looking at what happens inside the bureaucracy, you know, Anthony Downs' thing. So what happens is in 1971, Bill Niskanen in 1971, he looks at what happens within a bureaucracy that leads to the amount of public goods that get provided, or the amount of goods, not necessarily public goods in our pure public goods sense, but goods that are being produced by the government, how much of that gets produced, and how does the demand and supply of that all work out? So he wrote a book called Bureaucracy and Representative Government. Bureaucracy and Representative Government. What he looked at is that suppose that the bureaucrat is trying to maximize the size of their budget, right? So he's looking at, okay, a bureaucrat's out there, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to maximize the size of their budget, right? And this is what this book is about. Now, in 1975, he wrote a paper for the Journal of Law and Economics, and that is in your folder. That's in the bureaucracy folder. And that's a reasonable analysis of what we're going to be talking about here. Okay, so again, you should probably take a look at that paper, but what he really the summary of what it is that the bureaucrat's trying to maximize the size of the budget, and there's an information asymmetry in that he says the legislature is demanding a certain amount of a government good, The legislature is the one that decides. They're out there saying, okay, I'm the chairman of the House Education Subcommittee on Appropriations for Education, right? So I'm on the House Appropriations Committee and I'm on the subcommittee for education, or I'm on the subcommittee of natural resources, okay? And what I want to do is I decide, our committee gets together and we say, we want to increase the amount of preservation of natural resources, okay? And the idea is that there's an information asymmetry in the sense that the bureaucrat knows what the demand for these government services are from the legislative body, but the legislative body doesn't know the cost of providing it. That is, the bureaucrat knows here's how much it's going to cost to produce so much more in protection of natural resources. And it knows the demand curve of the legislative body, but not the other way. Legislative body doesn't know how much it costs to produce the stuff. So let me just write that down here, is that we have that the demander of government goods is the legislative body. It could be the Appropriations Committee, for example. And the supplier is the bureaucrat. Right? The bureaucracy knows what the supply of, how to produce these government goods. And so, as I said before, there's this asymmetry in that the bureau chief knows this. It knows the demand of the legislative body. But the legislative body doesn't know the cost of producing the government good. And so what Niskanen says is that let's think about what would happen if you were a profit-maximizing bureaucrat. You're trying, not profit-maximizing, you're trying to maximize the size of your budget, right? And the reason you want to do that is because being the secretary of a really large department, people will know you'll be on the news and people will be interviewing you, and maybe you have a big office, and people ask you to speak different places, and maybe after you're gone, you'll be able to be on the board of companies, etc. Okay, so you're a profit maximizer. You're trying to maximize the size of your budget. So let's say we then have the demand of the this is dollars or price here, price per unit, and this is the demand of the legislative body. And let's say there's a cost, and we'll just, to make it simple, let's say there's a long-run marginal cost curve that looks like that, so it'd be the same as the average cost, right, if we make it constant, just to make the picture simpler. And I know Professor Butters has told me to draw bigger pictures, but I already drew it, okay? So the idea here is, oh, what the heck? Why don't I make a big one? I saw him doing a big one earlier. He goes really big, okay? So we have the demand of the bureaucrat, and we got output here. We'll call that Q, and there's some dollar amount that it costs to produce a particular amount. And let's say that the long-run marginal cost curve looks like this. And if you were trying to maximize the consumer surplus of the legislative body, where would you go? You'd go here, right? That would be Q star. Because points beyond Q star, the marginal benefit to the legislative body is less than the marginal cost of producing those extra units. Any points to the left, the marginal benefit's bigger than the marginal cost, and so the consumer surplus is going to be that triangle. We'll call that a triangle ABC. Right? So at Q star, then we've maximized the consumer surplus of the legislative body. But if what you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize the size of your budget, you're the bureaucrat, you want to produce more than Q star if you can. You want to produce as much as you can. You want the legislative body to agree that, okay, we'll take this amount, we'll spend this much on your particular, whatever service you're providing. Let's say this is, again, Department of Natural Resources. So they want some protection of the natural resources, the marginal benefit to them of additional units of protection of natural resources is getting smaller, and we've got some long-run marginal cost curve. Notice that I could go out to here, and let's say we'll call it the quantity that the bureaucrat will want. Now, notice that the net benefit to the legislative body, right, is going to be getting smaller because I'm adding negative surplus here. I could push the legislative body out to the point, and they would still agree, right? They would still appropriate the money. I'd walk in and say, this is my proposed budget, right? I come in as the bureaucrat, and I come in, I'm the, let's say I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources, or I guess whatever entity does natural resource protection. Let's say it's the state of Michigan. So I'm the director of Department of Natural Resources. I come in with my budget to the Appropriations Committee, and I say, look, here's the proposed budget. We want you to give X amount of dollars to the Department of Natural Resources. Okay? I could propose an amount that just up to this triangle equaling that triangle. At that point, there's zero advantage, and so there's zero consumer surplus. So effectively, the legislative body would be indifferent between not funding it at all and funding that amount. But the point that Niskanen is making is that I can push this quantity to be greater. And as long as, we'll call this D and E, as long as the triangle ABC, right, that triangle, is bigger than the triangle CDE, then we'll get approval. And so what happens is essentially in Niskanen's model, the demander for the government services is the legislative body's appropriations committee. The supplier is the bureaucracy. And you, as the head bureaucrat of your agency, let's say, as I was saying, the director of natural resources, you propose within the governor's budget, you come in and you say, okay, here's the budget. We want X million dollars for the Department of Natural Resources. You know what the demand curve for the Appropriations Committee looks like. They don't know what the real cost of this is, right? They don't know that the long-run marginal cost is here. They don't have an idea. So you come up to them and you say, you know what, hey, we'll provide, we want, $500 million for the DNR's budget this year. The legislative body goes, okay, we're okay with that, right? As long as you haven't hit the point where you're past where this triangle is less than that triangle, as long as you haven't gone out that far, then the thing will get approved. Okay. So there's a number of criticisms that Niskanin's paper. Dick Wagner was one who responded to this in particular. Although Niskanin's, this was basically sort of made Niskanin relatively famous. This is the first one to really get out there and try and look at, hey, can we figure out how the demand and supply of goods that are being produced by the bureaucracy, how is that being determined? As I said before, most of the earlier literature was dealing with how do things operate within the bureaucracy. Gordon Tullock and Anthony Downs and going back to Max Weber, and said that was the focus. So Wagner comes along and he says, well, there's a couple of things in this to criticize about this. If you look at, first of all, he says there's really too much theoretical power in the bureaucrat's hand. This is why would we think that the bureaucrats don't have any why would we think that the legislature can't figure out what the cost of this stuff is? Why wouldn't you bid out, right? Why wouldn't the legislature bid this out to private hands? Right, or private companies, right? Why wouldn't they say, well, you know what, legislature or Department of Natural Resources, we think that you're asking too much for this. Why don't we go out and bid this thing out? Which, and actually in the state of Indiana, that really started to happen. But what's the problem? The problem is, again, against Wagner's suggestion, is that how to measure what you're asking for, right? I might be able to say, I might focus on the inputs, and I might say, okay, you're going to provide me with so many natural resources personnel to go out and check whether the chronic wasting disease among the deer is, how's that being taken care of, et cetera. So I might have some way to measure, but it's difficult. And of course, that means, again, as we pointed out before, it's difficult to put into a contract, right? Again, you're going to, if you do it, you're probably going to end up measuring the input rather than the output. I'm going to provide so many DNR employees rather than I'm going to accomplish this with the Department of Natural Resources. If you look at it, there's been a lot of attempts to eliminate things like the Department of Education, for example. The Department of Education was put together by Jimmy Carter in an attempt to gain political points from the teachers' unions. And Ronald Reagan tried to get rid of it. When I was congressional chief of staff to Congressman Nick Smith in the Congress, the 104th Congress, which came in after the contract with America, and the Republicans got control of the House for the first time, and in like 50 years or something, and the Newt Gingrich became Speaker, and Dick Armey became Majority Leader, etc. That should have been a time when you could get rid of it, and it didn't happen, right? It's very Reagan. I think Reagan maybe said something about there's basically something like nothing has a lifespan like that of government bureaucracy or government department, whatever. So it's very hard to get rid of it. Wagner argues that what may be going on is that there's not this conflict between the Bureau and the legislative body. He argues that both the legislature and the bureaucracy want to maximize the budget. They both want to maximize the size of the budget. So, you know, when Coleman Young was mayor of Detroit, right? Maybe he has lots and lots of sanitation workers, but you know, the city council may want to have lots and lots of sanitation workers, because then there's lots of people that want to vote for the members of the city council, right? So it is, you know, what Wagner's arguing is that there may not be this asymmetric information on the part of the Bureau and the legislative body. They both may be trying to get as big a government as they can, because especially if you're looking at where government employees will tend to vote for the people that are in the legislative body. You may want to, that may be why that would be happening. All right, there's in Wagner's thing comes from Public Finance Revenues and Expenditures in a Democratic Society that he wrote in 1983, if you're interested. But in any event, again, you will maybe want to take a look at Bill Niskanin's article in the folder there. All right, so with that, we will move on to the next topic, and good luck with everything back home. Bye.